President number 36, Lyndon B. Johnson. It's not every day that you hear of someone larger than life, full of contradictions, whose appetites affect everybody around them. Well, LBJ was one of them, and chances are that he's affected you too, for better or for worse. He was born in 1908 in Stonewall, Texas. He began reading at the age of 2, but he hated school. His mother would walk him to school and drill him with lessons as they walked. He graduated from high school at the age of 15, but instead of going to college, he went to California with his buddies, did a couple of odd jobs, but then one day he decided that this hard work and hard labor laying tar on the road was not very pleasant, so he said, "Mom is right, I'm going to go back to college." He worked his way through college picking grapes. Then he became a teacher in a school for Mexican Americans. His students would arrive hungry, and he saw their poverty firsthand and found it unfair that college was closed to people who could not afford it. He became interested in politics and became a legislative aide to other politicians. He cultivated friends and worked tirelessly for them. He was full of energy. Then a friend introduced him to Claudia Taylor, and he found her attractive, so he proposed marriage to her the very next day. She thought he was joking, but they were married by the end of the year. He was 27. Now, he liked the initials LBJ, so he began calling his wife Lady Bird, as in Lady Bird Johnson. They had 2 daughters, Linda Bear Johnson and Lucy Baines Johnson, and when he bought a ranch, he named it the LBJ Ranch. He became a congressman, and he worked so hard that somebody said that Einstein was wrong. Energy is not equal to MC squared. Energy is equal to LBJ. When World War II broke out, he joined the Navy, but it was mostly a desk job. And even though he later said that he saw the horrors of war and even got a silver medal, basically he was on a plane that got shot at, and the plane came back safely. That was it. At 40, he became a senator. He learned all the senators' names and positions and family names. And though he was a Democrat, he supported Eisenhower. He believed in bipartisanship and getting things done. He worked 7 days a week. People talked about the LBJ treatment, his powers of persuasion to get you to do what he wanted. He'd shake your hand and not let go and lean in really close to your face. He'd flatter you or threaten you or beg. He'd look sentimental and teary-eyed. He'd talk to you for 10 minutes or 4 hours. He'd call you on the phone, then he'd call your wife, and then he'd call your children. He never tired. He'd outdid everybody and moved up to become Senate Majority Leader, the best one the U.S. has ever had. Now, Johnson wanted to run for president, and one day Joseph Kennedy came over and said he'd support Johnson if he chose John Kennedy to be his vice presidential candidate. LBJ said no, and Kennedy's younger brother Robert was insulted and never forgave LBJ. They became enemies. But as things turned out, when LBJ ran for president, Kennedy ran for president too, and Johnson became his vice presidential candidate. Kennedy made Johnson head of the space program, NASA, and there was a promise to put a man on the moon in 10 years. Now, Johnson was very intelligent, but he was very crude. He'd be walking with you, then he'd go off and pee behind a tree. He hated the cosmopolitan flair that Kennedy had at those parties. He felt out of place, and the aides around him snubbed him. In fact, there was talk that Robert Kennedy wanted to be the next vice presidential candidate for the next election. We'll never know if Kennedy wanted to substitute Johnson with his brother Robert, because then came the assassination. President Kennedy was dead, and Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One carrying the coffin back to Washington, D.C. He allowed Jackie to stay at the White House until she was ready to move out. He stayed elsewhere, and one of the first things he did was write a letter of condolence to little Caroline and John. He also allowed the children to complete that year of schooling at the White House. He opened a commission, the Warren Commission, to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. They turned in an 888-page report concluding that Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin, acted alone, and that the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald also acted alone. This only fueled speculation. Now, Johnson would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. He would work for 8 hours, take a nap, and then work another 8 hours. He did this every day while he was in the White House. He had aides and assistants run around chasing him, taking notes. He would talk to them during meals. They followed him even to the toilet. They interrupted him at night. It was work, work, work. And domestically, Johnson turned in more legislative bills than any other president, more than Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, civil rights leader Malcolm X was assassinated, And then there was a lot of unrest. It was a turbulent time. Now, Johnson at first kind of dragged his feet. He wanted to sign the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had introduced. But finally, he came around, signed it. And after that, well, he said, there goes the South, because the South went mostly Republican from that point on. He called his program the War on Poverty, the Great Society. Most telling was the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. He started Job Corps to help youth develop marketable skills. He started the Neighborhood Youth Corps to give you work experience. He started an urban development program. He extended food stamps. He introduced 30 education bills, including Head Start for preschoolers. There was a Higher Education Act, which increased college aid, opened better college libraries, new graduate centers, and several technical institutes. Classrooms for several 100,000 students and 25 to 30 new community colleges every year. He increased college loans from a maximum of $1,000 to $2,500. He started Medicare for older citizens. He started Medicaid for welfare recipients. He raised Social Security by 13%, and he increased benefits for widows who were over 60. The Child Nutrition Act improved nutritional assistance for children, including the school breakfast program. There was federal funding for educational television, like the public broadcasting systems. There were also several museums that were opened up, such as the Smithsonian Institute. He opened the Department of Transportation with several new railway systems and a Vehicle Safety Act. There were free contraceptives for the poor, and there were meal programs for the elderly, even hand-delivered. Cigarette packages now had to have warning labels, and there was a Fair Packing and Labeling Act which enforced labeling of food. There was a Child Safety Act, and meat now had to meet federal standards and be labeled. The Truth in Lending Act, where full disclosures had to be given by banks and other lenders. There was a Wholesome Poultry Act, the Land Sales Disclosure Act, and the Radiation Safety Act. There was a House and Urban Development, which facilitated loans. There were rural developments that helped farmers borrow to improve or buy land. And there was a Fair Housing Act to ban racial discrimination in rental or purchases of housing. There was a Federal Gun Control Act. And if you like the environment, listen to this. There were acts for water quality, clean air, the wilderness, endangered species preservation, National Trail System, Wild and Scenic River, Land and Water Conservation, Solid Waste Disposal, Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control, National Historic Preservation, Aircraft Noise Abatement, and the National Environmental Policy Act. In 5 years, Johnson had introduced and passed 226 major legislative bills. Aid to the poor had tripled. 1 million Americans had retrained in these new programs. 2 million children had participated in Head Start. Americans living under poverty dropped from 22% to 12%. Before Johnson, 55% of African Americans lived below the poverty line. When he left office, it was down to 27%. But the South didn't like him because of the Civil Rights Program. And a lot of these programs were dismantled or reduced or put under state hands by Presidents Nixon, Ford, or Reagan. But a lot of them do survive one way or the other today. But during all of this was the Vietnam War. You see, North and South Vietnam. North was communist, South was our ally. The North Vietnamese wanted to take over South Vietnam. And the United States felt that if South Vietnam fell, the domino policy would come into place, so that Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia would become communist too. So the U.S. backed South Vietnam. But nobody thought much of our military presence there in Vietnam until August of 1964, when a Vietnamese gunboat shot at one American destroyer. Well, the destroyer returned fire, jets came and blew up the gunboats, and that was the end of that. But then another destroyer radioed in that it was being attacked. Of course, they were mistaken. They were just jittery. But Johnson was confused, got angry, and he ordered jets to bomb North Vietnamese military bases. Now, at this point, Johnson was very popular, and he ran for election in his own right and won 61% of the popular vote. Now, the U.S. didn't want to invade North Vietnam because the Soviets and the Chinese were stationed there, so it would only contain the war in South Vietnam. In order to do this, General Westmoreland said we need to increase the number of troops, and increase the number of troops we did. Now, Johnson was trying to get the North Vietnamese president, Ho Chi Minh, to agree to a peace talk, but Ho Chi Minh didn't budge. He said that even if the Americans killed 10 of his troops to one of theirs, that the Vietnamese would still win. So General Westmoreland said, we need more troops. So more troops came, from 2,000 to 170,000 to eventually 500,000 troops in Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh still didn't budge. Meanwhile, the president of Dominican Republic, Juan Bosch, was overthrown, and the United States, fearing a communist takeover, sent in 22,000 troops. They took care of the problem in just a couple of weeks. But Vietnam was different. You see, the Vietnamese had already fought off the Chinese, the Japanese, and the French. Generations had known nothing but war, and the U.S. began its bombing campaign. It was called Operation Rolling Thunder. It was to last 8 weeks, but it lasted roughly 3 years. Now, there were communists among the South Vietnamese. They were called the Viet Cong, and the U.S. would relocate the peasants to keep them away from the communist influence. It went on and on, relocation programs. Now, this was the first time that the average American could watch the war on television, and they were horrified. This caused a generation gap in the American family. The youth no longer trusted their leaders, therefore they no longer trusted their own parents. This caused a cultural war and a lot of protests. Make love, not war. People didn't trust anybody over 30 years old. This even affected the comic books and the cartoons. If you look at the Archie comic books, you see the miniskirts and the hippies. And of course, there was the musical influence. A lot of songs that came out around the time dealt with protests. Then, of course, fashion. There was the miniskirt that came out. A sign of rebellion, the hippie clothes, the colors, the bright colors. Then, of course, Hollywood. There was a new kind of actor, and there were new kinds of movie. Even people started questioning their belief in God in the movies. And then there was a confusion. There was a misogyny at the time. There was also the sexually confused male. Movies like Easy Rider, then hippie shows on television like Mod Squad. There was a women's liberation movement that came out, and of course there was always the sexual revolution that came in with that. The counterculture, don't trust anybody over 30. There was also the drug culture that came out. Hippies, 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 the peace movement. A lot of famous people had participated in the Vietnam War, and they were affected in many, many different ways. Several of them you can recognize right here. And when Johnson opened up the draft, many people resisted. And when Cassius Clay, aka today Muhammad Ali, refused to go to Vietnam when he got drafted, a lot of people followed suit. They would burn their draft cards in public. And the war went on and on. Well, the troops felt there was no clear objective. You weren't capturing a city. You were kind of like, well, trying to maintain some kind of peace in South Vietnam. And the bombings went on and on and on. And Johnson got increasingly frustrated. How could he get out of this mess? He was sorry he got in there to begin with. And he pressed on to try to get that peace talk going. It seemed like there was no end to this Vietnamese war. There was chemical warfare, napalm, which caused fifth-degree burns. There were also pesticides like Agent Orange spread all over the crops that would try to get the average Vietnamese to get away from the communists and go south. None of this had any effect. Let's put it this way. When Johnson took office, 5 American troops died that year. By 1968, there were 46 dying each day. And in those 5 years, there are about 1 million Vietnamese dead, not counting the countless wounded. Now, 30,000 Americans died fighting in Vietnam under Johnson's administration. The bombing lasted 3 years. 8 million tons of bombs were used in Vietnam, 3 times the amount that was used in World War II. That's 300 tons of bombs for every man, woman, and child living in Vietnam. Crops were also sprayed to deny food to the enemy. But it wasn't enough. Some advised, why don't we use a nuclear bomb? Well, Johnson refused. And the Vietnamese shot down 700 American aircraft with the aid of Soviet anti-aircraft weapons. There was no end in sight, not even with 500,000 American troops on the ground. And during these turbulent times, well, 3 Americans died in a spacecraft. A fire broke out, exploded. It was a setback for the NASA space program. And it was election year, and now, to add insult to injury, Robert Kennedy decided to run for the nomination of the Democratic Party against his old boss, Lyndon B. Johnson. And with protesters outside the White House yelling every day, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Well, Johnson had had enough. He announced that he would not run for president again. And just a week after that announcement, Martin Luther King was assassinated as he stood on a motel room balcony. And about a month later, while Robert Kennedy was campaigning in a hotel kitchen, he too was shot down and killed. So Johnson started working tirelessly so that his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who was now the Democratic nominee for president, would win the election. And he finally got Ho Chi Minh to a peace talk. They would go to Paris and talk for peace. A truce was imminent. But then, foreign expert Henry Kissinger, a Johnson advisor, went to speak to Nixon to tell him that a peace truce was imminent. If there was a peace truce, well, Humphrey could win and Nixon could lose. Well, the talk today is that Nixon sent somebody to South Vietnam to tell them to hold on, that they could get a better deal with Nixon in the White House. We don't know if that's true, but it's very likely that it is. Well, conclusion, Ho Chi Minh stepped out of the Paris peace talks. There would be no truce. Well, that was Johnson's last chance for peace. Nixon went into the White House, became president, and made Henry Kissinger his national security advisor. The war would drag on for another 4 years. Kissinger, in the end, helped end the Vietnam War, and he would win a Nobel Peace Prize for helping end the war, whose peace talks he had helped sabotage a few years earlier. And because the Paris peace talks of 1968 did not take place, the war went on for another few years. And in those few years, well, another 20,000 Americans died, along with another 1 million Vietnamese. As for Johnson, he went back to his ranch in Texas and retired, went on a poor diet, and died around 1973. And when he passed away, the Vietnam War was still going on. This is Cool Talk.